Top 3 Military Encounters with the Paranormal, Part 1. Now, if that's not a mouthful of a title, I don't know what is. Now, if you look at the bottom of the video, you can see that I've completely sold out and I have a Patreon now, so I'm going to show that right here. You can donate if you want to. If not, it's okay. I'm still going to keep doing the same videos. I just have a Patreon now in case you want to donate so I can, buy a new laptop or something. Anyways, just enjoy the video. And yeah, let's get into it. If you hear a background noise, it's most likely the heater I have because it's kind of been running a lot and it's kind of making a noise. But that's because it's minus 20 degrees Celsius here and it's pretty cold. So if you can ignore that, then great. If not, I guess you can click off the video, I don't know. Anyways, into the video. I've spoken before a little bit about time slips and alternate universes and higher dimensions and things like that. I don't know if you consider that paranormal, but I'm going to put it in this because I found this to be pretty interesting. I read about it before, but now I know the guy's name, so I figured I'd put it in here. So especially during wartime, we've heard stories about people having time slips, going to seemingly alternate universes or alternate worlds, seemingly skipping forward or backward in time, and then getting slingshotted back. So in 1935, a man named Sir Victor Goddard, who was an air marshal, flew a Hawker Hart biplane to Edinburgh, Scotland, from his home base in Andover, England. It was a weekend visit, and on a Sunday, Goddard decided to fly over an abandoned airfield, Drem, which is not far from Edinburgh. It was closer to his final destination than the airport in which he landed at. Now, something to note is that Drem was constructed during the First World War, and by this time, 1935, it was in very much disrepair, had been taken over by nature a little bit. There were cows along the fields around it grazing, trees had started to grow up, and the bunkers were just falling apart. Very much into a state of disrepair, very much abandoned. So that following Monday happened to be a fateful day for Goddard, because he began the flight back to his home base, but he encountered a bizarre storm that gave him problems controlling his aircraft. He was flying an open cockpit plane over mountainous terrain without radio navigational aids or cloud flying instruments. And during the storm, he noticed something pretty bizarre. These strange brownish yellow clouds appeared, and he seemed to have lost control of his plane, which then began to spiral towards the ground. Goddard was unable to stop the spin, and he was uncertain of where he was or his location. So things looked pretty bad. He thought he was going to die. He had no way to control the plane. He feared that the rapid fall would lead to a crash in the mountains. So obviously by this point you have very much of a little chance to come out of it before you crash. But he did. All of a sudden he noticed that the sky was darker than ever, and the clouds were continuing to be a yellowish brown. Goddard was now flying at 150 miles per hour, and he was still falling. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally succeeded in leveling out his plane and avoided a crash. But something strange had happened. He looked around. He was trying to determine his location, and he noticed the sky was suddenly bright with golden sunlight, and he was approaching the old field Drem. Now remember, Drem was built during the First World War and was completely abandoned by this point in 1935. It had been nearly 20 years since there had been planes present here. However, when Goddard flew over this old abandoned airfield, he noticed that it was the same airfield, yet everything was different. The hangars were new. There were 4 planes on the ground, 3 were familiar biplanes, but the other plane was a monoplane and it was painted in an unfamiliar yellow, which is odd because the RAF at the time had no such plane like that. The mechanics were dressed in blue overalls, which Goddard thought odd because they have brown overalls. Even more curious was that they didn't seem to notice him or pay attention to him. It's like he was flying, but he was invisible to them. So just after he flew over the old airfield, he caught the storm again, but he was flung back to his time, and he was able to get to his home base safely. Now, in 1939, Goddard noticed how the RAF trainers began to be painted yellow, and the mechanics switched to blue coveralls from brown ones. So the RAF introduced a new training monoplane exactly like the one he had seen in his flight over Drem, and it was called the Magister. He learned that the airfield that he had passed over had been completely refurbished for the Second World War. Now, back in 1935, after Goddard had told other friends and colleagues of his, they obviously thought he was just crazy or drunk or lying, so he just kind of kept it to himself until he finally wrote down the experience in 1966. So what do you think? Did Sir Victor Goddard really skip ahead in time and catch a glimpse into the future? Or was it just a glimpse into an alternate timeline? Or perhaps maybe he made it up? That's all for you to decide. So obviously whenever something happens to you when you're in the military, something paranormal or supernatural or scary, whatever, you kind of have to keep it to yourself because, your superiors are just going to look at you like you have three heads and you're probably get roasted a whole bunch by other people, and it's just better just to keep it to yourself, especially in that environment. So this guy just is referred to as Sergeant M, who I understand why he'd want to keep his identity a secret given, the military environment and stuff. So in 2015, Sergeant M was assigned to do a 24-hour desk duty, which seems to entail keeping a full 24-hour watch on people at the barracks. One of their duties was to keep an eye on soldiers who were demonstrating psychological issues or who had been confined to their barracks to protect those around them and were considered like a high risk for whatever reason. The specific person that Sergeant M is talking about in this case didn't make it past private second class because he was so angry and hate-filled and just a troublemaker, so he was only in there for 20 months in uniform. And it was rumored that he was deep into black magic and Satanism and all the fun stuff, you know what I mean? And apparently he left his barracks like a complete mess, so I'll quote the guy here from what he said. When he was kicked out, he left his barracks room a complete mess. I've seen portable toilets cleaner than this room. The toilet had been broken down and didn't flush, but he had continued to use it. In the closet there were mountains of trash, rotten food, and the sink in the refrigerator also had rotten food. The shower was also filled with garbage and water, and aside from the mess, there were strange things as well. When the commander, first sergeant, and myself, the supply sergeant, went into his room, we found chicken bones tied together, hanging from strings from the ceiling. They had been lashed together, seemingly to make archaic symbols. We counted roughly 24 before we quit counting. The floor was covered in grime and candles had been lit in a circle. All the furniture had been stacked out of the way or shoved into the closet. I'll spare you the description of the smell, but the whole room had an unsettling feeling to it. The air in the room felt wrong. I couldn't tell at the time because the smell or the filth, whatever the reason, I didn't want to be in there. We called for a special cleanup team and put in a work order to have the room stripped and cleaned by professionals. After they were finished, the room was completely spotless. And not long after that, even though the room was still unoccupied, claims started to come in that they could hear banging around within. Like odd odors would emanate from the room, such as the scent of burning plastic. Some smells could not be identified. The witness says that he ended up being assigned to the duty roster that put him into close proximity to the, quotes, haunted room. And one evening, he had quite the experience when he was on duty with a private. At some point in the night, they suddenly heard a roar, which is described as sounding like metal tearing, while someone played a recording of a scream, except it was distorted and kind of in reverse. So obviously they're a little startled, a little shaken, but they still go over to the room, and being the senior rank, the guy instructed the other soldier to call the barracks representative, which is called an LNO, I guess, and have him get to the desk as soon as possible. And this is another quote. 5 minutes later, he and I are using his master key to gain access to the room while my private covers the hallway from the desk. Staying with the phone and also watching our barracks, as soon as we enter the foyer, we're hit with the smell of dog poo and burned plastic. Neither of us can really identify the source, but the room is completely empty. We sweep and clear every nook and cranny, later agreeing that we felt like we were being watched the whole time. We found nothing, but the smell remained. We decided to re-secure the room and not log the incident because I, for one, didn't want to look like a crazy idiot when my bosses read my report. We moved to the door, like we go to exit, and we turned to close the door, but a massive force hit the door from inside the room, shoving the barracks representative out of the doorway and slamming the door shut. None of the doors are allowed to slam. They all have a hydraulic arm at the top to prevent that. They're not even quick to close if a 200-pound male leans on them. So someone slamming it hard would have to move a grown man is basically impossible, especially considering it had worked moments prior when we entered the room. We tried to open the lock again, but this time the keycard wouldn't work. We agreed that neither of us really wanted to go back in there anyways, and we agreed to not report any of it, because we would be taken as seriously as just about anybody else. After that incident, I kept an ear out but didn't hear anything nearly as dramatic again. On one other occasion, it sounded like there was some kind of shuffling coming from inside the room, like someone was moving around, but I kept a stalwart face about it, and I ordered my private to stay away from it as well. To this day, I have no idea, can't explain what happened in that room. So what do you think happened? Was there an entity in that room, or did it all just happen to be imagination, or were they making it up? It's really up to you to decide. In my opinion, if what Sergeant Amish said is true, then it's very possible that the private could have opened the door for something else to come there, or maybe he himself was possessed and brought something else into the barracks. It's really hard to say. This last one is a little shorter, but I still like it. It happened at the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. Now, the White Sands Missile Range has obviously been known for a lot of high strangeness, and I might do a video on things that have happened there because I found that area very fascinating myself. Now, this soldier says that he was on guard duty one evening along with his partner, and it was like a pretty uneventful night. It was pretty boring even. Yet on this night, they had a pretty crazy encounter that has kind of stayed with them ever since. He says that when they were doing their patrol, his partner just randomly stopped him and pointed off into the desert, where there appeared to be two pinpoints of light hovering over the sand about 6 feet in the air. And they thought that maybe it was just a wild animal that was standing on its hind legs or something. But they crept closer to its position to find that it seemed to be a tall, dark figure just standing out in the middle of nowhere. It became apparent that it was a cloaked individual, a male, although with a deeply wrinkled face that looked, quote, ancient. Now, it said there should have been no one out there at this point, especially that close to their base. And it's noted as saying that the guy gave off a really weird vibe, since he was just kind of standing there, staring at them, even as they had just approached. It said that he looked like he was Native American, but they couldn't really tell, because his skin was so creased and so craggy, pockmarked, and just very, very old looking. He was wrapped up in some kind of cape or a cloak, and they couldn't see his hands or his feet. They called out to him to identify himself, but the guy didn't do anything. He didn't even flinch. He said he doesn't even know if he heard him or not. So now they're a little bit unsettled, and he thinks that they're dealing with someone who's seriously disturbed or someone who's just kind of senile, who wandered away from their home. So they know that they have to get him out of there, or like apprehend him or something. He just cannot be there. So they start getting closer to this guy who's just standing like a statue, stock still. And he just sort of drops. And there's a flutter of the cape and he's gone. Just gone. His partner calls out in surprise, and right then a coyote runs right past us, practically close enough to touch, before dashing off into the night. And that old guy, well, there's no sign of him, so it freaked him out quite badly for sure. Now that story, I think, is the definition of a proper skinwalker. I know that a lot of times you might hear stories of a skinwalker where it's like this weird kind of pale creature that has no features, but this right here is like a Navajo skinwalker, I think anyways. What do you think? Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it at least a little bit. And yeah, if you want to support my Patreon, that's up to you. No obligation either way. I know that things are a little strange right now in the world, some from 2020 and even into now. And for sure, I know that some of the things I talk about may have like a logical explanation, but for me, I like to indulge in this stuff. I like to just kind of lean into it in that way. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm way off, maybe I'm right. You really never know in this big world. Anyways, just have a good night, and I'll see you in the next video.